Chapter 25 of the Book of This and That. It is only now and then, when some great disaster like the sinking of the Empress of Ireland occurs, that man recovers his ancient dread of the sea. We have grown comfortably intimate with the sea. We use it as a highway of business and pleasure with as little hesitation as the land. The worst we fear from it is the discomfort of seasickness, and we are inclined to treat that half comically, like a boy's sickness from tobacco. There are still a few persons who are timid of it, as the more civilized among us are timid of force. But they cannot sleep if they are near its dull roar, and they hate, like nagging, the damnable iteration of its waves. For most of us, however, the sea is a domesticated wonder. We pace its shores with as little nervousness as we walk past the bears and lions in the zoological gardens. With less nervousness, indeed, for we trust our bodies to the sea in little scoops of wood, and even fling ourselves half naked into its waters as a luxury, an indulgence bolder than any we allow ourselves with the tamest lions. Let an accident occur, however, let a ship go down, or a bather be carried out in the wash of the tide, and something in our bones remembers the old fears of the monster in the waters. We realize suddenly that we who trust the sea are like the people in other lands who live under the fiery mountains that have poured death on their ancestors time and again. We are amazed at the faith of men who rebuild their homes under a volcano, but the sea over which we pass with so smiling a certainty is more restless than a volcano and more clamorous for victims. Originally man seems to have dreaded all water, whether of springs or of rivers or of the sea, in the idea that it was a dragon's pasture. There is no myth more universal than that of the beast that rises up out of the water and demands as tribute the fairest woman of the earth. Perseus rescued Andromeda from such a monster as this, and it is as the slayer of a water beast that St. George lives in legend, however history may seek to degrade him into a dishonest meat contractor. Not that it was always a maiden who was sacrificed. Probably in the beginning the sea beast made no distinction of sex among its victims. In many of the legends we find it claiming men and women indifferently. In the story of Jonah it demands a male victim, and in many countries today there are men who will not rescue anyone from drowning on the ground that if you disappoint the sea of one victim it will sooner or later have you, whether you are male or female, for your pains. These men regard the sea as some men regard God, a beneficent being if you get on the right side of it. They see it as the home of one who is half divinity and half monster, and who, when once his passion for sacrifice has been satisfied, will look on you with a shining face. Hence of all these gifts to it of handsome youths and well-born children. Hence the marriage to it of soothing maidens. In the latter case, no doubt, there is also the idea of a magical marriage, which will promote the fertility of water and land. Matthew Arnold's Forsaken Merman, if you let the anthropologist get hold of it, will be shown to be but the exquisite echo of some forgotten marriage of the sea. These superstitions may reasonably enough be considered as for the most part dramatizations of a sense of the sea's insecurity. We have ceased to believe in dragons and mermaids, chiefly because civilization has built up for us a false sense of security, and you can arrange in any of Cook's branch offices to spend your week-end silent upon a peak in Darien, commanding the best views of the Pacific. We have, as it were, advertised the sea till it seems as innocuous as a patent medicine. We no more expect to be injured by it than to be poisoned at our meals. We have lost both our fears and our wonders, and as we glide through the miraculous places of ocean, we no longer listen for the song of the sirens, but sit down comfortably to read the latest issue of the Continental edition of the Daily Mail. It is a question whether we have lost or gained more by our podgy indifference. Sometimes it seems as if there were a sentence of "Thou fool" hanging over us as we lounge in our deck chairs. In any case, the men who were troubled by the fancy of Scylla and Charybdis, and were conscious of the nearness of Leviathan, and saw without surprise the rising of islands of doom in the sunset, went out none the less highly hearted for their fears. We are sometimes inclined to think that no one ever quite enjoyed the wonders of the sea before the 19th century. We have been brought up to believe that all the ancients regarded the sea, with Horace, as a sailor's grave, and that was the end of their emotions concerning it. Even in the 18th century it has been dinned into us, men took so little impartial pleasure in the sea that a novel like Roderick Random, though full of nautical adventures, does not contain 3 sentences in praise of its beauty. This has always seemed to me to be great nonsense. No doubt men were not so much at their ease with the sea in the old days as they are now, but be sure the terrors of the sea did not stun the ancients into indifference to its beauty any more than the terrors of tragedy stupefy you or me into insensitiveness. There is a sense of all the magnificence of the sea in the cry of Jonah. All thy billows and thy waves passed over me. Then I said, I am cast out of thy sight. The waters compassed me about, even to the soul. The depth closed me round about. The weeds were wrapped about my head. I went down to the bottom of the mountains. There is perhaps more of awe than of the pleasure of the senses in this. It has certainly nothing of the "Oh, for the life of the sailor lad" jollity of the ballad concert. But then not even the most enthusiastic sea literature of this sea-ridden time has. Mr. Conrad, who has found in the sea a new fatherland, if the phrase is not too anomalous, never approaches it in that mood of flirtation that we get in music-hall songs. He is as conscious of its dreadful mysteries as the author of the Book of Jonah, and as aware of its terrors and portents as the mariners of the Odyssey. He discovers plenty of humor in the relations of human beings with the sea, but this humor is the merest peering of stars in a night of tragic irony. His ships crash through the tumult of the waves like creatures of doom, even when they triumph as they do under the guidance of the brave. His sea, too, is haunted by invisible terrors, where more ancient sailors dreaded marvels that had shape and bulk. Mr. Masefield's love of the sea is to a still greater extent dominated by tragic shadows. There are few gloomier poems in literature than Dauber, in spite of the philosophy and calm of its close. It is only young men who have never gone farther over the water than for a sail to Southend who think of the sea as consistently a merry place. Not that all sailors set out to sea in the mood of Hamlet. The praise of the sea life that we find in their chanties is the praise of cheerful men, but it is also the praise of men who recognize the risks and treacheries that lurk under the ocean, a place of perils as manifestly as any jungle in the literature of man's adventures and fears. Perhaps it is necessary that the average man should ignore this dreadful quality in the sea. It would otherwise interfere too much with the commerce and the gaiety of nations. And after all, an ocean liner is from one point of view retreat from the greater dangers of the streets of London. But the imaginative man cannot be content to regard the sea with this ignorant amiableness. To him every voyage must still be a voyage into the unknown, where tall ships founder and deep death waits. He is no more impudently at home with the sea than was Shakespeare, who in Full Fathom 5 Thy Father Lies wrote the most imaginative poem of the sea in literature. Even Mr. Kipling, who has slapped most of the old gods on the back and pressed penny Union Jacks into their hands, writes of the sea as a strange world of fearful things, when he makes the deep sea cables sing their songs of the English. He aims at conveying the same sense of awe that we get when we read how Jonah went down in the belly of the great fish. Recall how the song of the deep sea cable begins. The wrecks dissolve above us. Their dust drops down from afar, down to the utter dark, where the blind white sea snakes are. There is no sound, no echo of sound, in the deserts of the deep, or the great grey level plains of ooze, where the shell bird cables creep. Mr. Kipling's particularizations of the blind white sea snakes and the level plains of ooze achieve nothing of the majesty of the far simpler bottoms of the mountains in the Song of Jonah. But when we get behind the more vulgar and prosaic phrasing, we see that the mood of Mr. Kipling and the Hebrew author is essentially the same. It is nevertheless man's constant dream that he will yet be able to defeat these terrors of the sea. He sees himself with elation as the conqueror of storms, and makes his plans to build a ship that no accident can sink, either in a wild sea or a calm. Before the Titanic went down, many people thought that the great discovery had been made. The Titanic went forth like a boast, and perished from one of the few accidents her builders had not provided against, like a victim of Nemesis in a Greek story. After that we ceased to believe in the unsinkable ship. But we thought at least that if only ships were furnished with enough boats to hold every one on board, no ship would ever again sink on a calm night carrying over 1,000 human beings to the bottom. Yet the Empress of Ireland had apparently boats enough to save every passenger, and now she has gone down with over 1,000 dead in shallow water at the mouth of a river, which the Times insists is at least as safe for navigation as the English Channel, and much safer than the Thames. It is as though the great machines we have invented were not machines for safety, but machines of destruction. They have us in their grip, as we thought we had the sea in ours. They do but betray us, indeed, in a new manner into an ancient snare, the snare of power that, like Leviathan, esteemeth iron as straw, and brass as rotten wood. We must no doubt go on dreaming that we shall master the sea, and that we shall do it with machines perfectly under our control. But if we are wise, we shall dream humbly and put off boasting until we are dead and quite sure that the triumph has been ours. It would be inhuman, I admit, never to feel a thrill of satisfaction at man's plodding success in breaking the sea and the air to his uses, in the discovery of fire, in the converting of lightning into an illumination for nurseries. But we still perish by fire and flood, by wind and lightning. We use them, but it is at our peril. It is as though we were favored strangers in the elements, but assuredly we are not conquerors. Mr. Wells, in The World Set Free, makes one of his characters, in the pride of human invention, shake his fist at the sun and cry out, "I'll have you yet!" It would have seemed to the Greeks blasphemy. And it still seems folly for man, a hairpin of flesh half hidden in trousers, to talk so. There is no victory that man has yet been able to achieve over matter that he does not before long discover has merely delivered him into a new servitude. Section 25.
Chapter 26. The Futurists. The appearance of the first number of Blast ought to put an end to the Futurist movement in England. One can forgive a new movement for anything except being tedious. Blast is as tedious as an attempt to play pistol by someone who has no qualification for the part, but whom neither friends nor the family clergyman can persuade into the decency of silence. It may be urged that Blast does not represent Futurism, but Vorticism. But after all, what is Vorticism but Futurism in an English disguise? Futurism, one might call it, bottled in England, and bottled badly. One has only to compare the pictures of the Vorticists recently shown at the Goupil Gallery with the pictures of the Italian Futurists which are being shown at the Doré, to see that the two groups differ from each other, not in their aims, but in their degrees of competence. No one going through the gallery of Italian paintings and sculpture could fail to see that Boccioni, with all his freakishness, his hideousness, his discordant introduction of real hair, glass eyes, and so forth, into his statuary, is an artist, powerful both in imagination and in technique. His study of a woman in a balcony is of a kind to bring an added horror into a night of human sacrifices in the Congo. His representation of matter destroys the appetite like a nightmare that has escaped from the obscene bowels of the sea. It produces, one cannot deny, an emotional effect. like some loathsome and shapeless thing. Compare with it most of the work that is being done in England under futurist inspiration, and you will see the immense difference in mere power. How seldom, apart from the work of Mr. Nevinson and one or two others, one finds among the latter a picture that is more interesting to the imagination than a metal toast rack. You see a picture that looks like a badly opened sardine tin, and you discover that it is called Portrait of a Mother and Infant. You see another that looks as if someone had taken a pair of scissors and cut a Union Jack into squares and triangles, and then had arranged the pieces at random in a patchwork quilt, and this, in turn, is labeled, say, Tennyson reading in memoriam to Queen Victoria. In either case, if the thing were done once, it might be funny, but the young artists are not content to have done it once. They keep on emptying the contents of ragbags and dustbins onto canvases in the most wearisome way. After a time, one can neither laugh at them nor take them seriously. One can simply repeat the name of their new review with violent sincerity. It is not, however, with the futurists themselves that one's chief quarrel is. It is with the people who do not support the futurists, but will not condemn them for fear of going down to posterity in the same boat as the people who once ridiculed Wagner and the Impressionists. This fear of the laughter of posterity is surely the last sign of decadence. It is the kind of thing that in the religious world would prevent you from criticizing the Prophet Dowie or Mrs. Eddy. It would compel you to take all new movements seriously simply because they were new. It would lead you to suspend your judgment about the tango till you were in your grave and your grandchild could come and whisper posterity's verdict to your tombstone. It is, I agree, a fine thing to have a hospitable mind for new things, to be able to greet a Wordsworth or a Manet appreciatively on his first rising. Artists have the right to demand that their work shall be judged not according to whether it fits in with certain old standards, but by its new power of affecting the emotions and the imagination. Great artists are continually extending the boundaries of their art, and there are, in the last resort, no rules to judge art by except that the artist must by one means or another succeed in bringing something to life. Boccioni satisfies the test in his sculpture, and therefore we must praise him, whether we like his methods or not. The majority of the futurists, on the other hand, produce no more effect of life than a diagram in Euclid, which has been crossed and blotted out with inks of various colors. Even, however, when, as in the case of the sculptures of Boccioni and the paintings of Severini, we admit that a brilliant imagination is at work, we are not necessarily committed to belief in the methods through which that imagination happens to express itself. It is possible to enjoy Whitman's poetry without believing that he has laid down the essential lines for the poetry of the future. One may agree that Boccioni and Severini have justified their methods by results, as far as they themselves are concerned. This does not mean that one agrees with them when they preach the adoption of their methods by artists in general. One takes the futurist movement seriously indeed only because various clever men have joined it, and because young Italians, more than most of us, seem to be justified in some form of violent reaction against the past that oppresses them. Whether futurism is merely the growing pains of a rejuvenated Italy, or whether it is a genuine manifestation of the old passion for violence, which first showed itself on the day on which Cain killed Abel, it is difficult at times to say. Probably it is a little of both. We wish, says Marinetti, praising violence like any Prussian in a famous manifesto, to glory war, the only health giver of the world. Militarism, patriotism, the destructive aim of the anarchist, the beautiful ideas that kill, the contempt for women. And again, we shall extol aggressive movement, feverish insomnia, the double quick-step, the somersault, the box on the ear, the fisticuff. It is very like Mr. Kipling at the age of 14, writing for a school magazine. If you could imagine a Kipling emancipated from religion and belief in British law and order. Later, as Marinetti proceeds to foretell the day on which the Futurists shall be slain by their still more futuristic successors, the schoolboy wakes once more in him. "And injustice, strong and healthy," he writes, how one envies the fine flourish with which he does it, "will burst forth radiantly in their eyes, for art can be naught but violence, cruelty, and injustice." One need not be too solemn with writing like that. It may be growing pains, it may be a new jingoism of the individual, but whichever it is amusing nonsense. One begins to swear only when people above the school age insist upon taking it seriously, as though it might contain a new gospel for humanity. It contains no new gospel at all. It is merely an entertaining restatement of an egoism of a kind that man was trying to discard before the days of bows and arrows. It is a schoolboyish plea for the revival of the tomahawk. It is a war song played in a city street on the bottom of a tin can. It has no more to do with art than a display of penny fireworks, an imitation of barking dogs at the calves of old gentlemen, or the escapades of Valentine Vox. It has no relation to art whatsoever, except from the fact that Marinetti himself is an exceedingly clever writer, as one may see from almost any of his manifestos. One may turn for an example of his manner to the following passage from his summons to the young to destroy the museums, the libraries, and the academies. "Those cemeteries of wasted efforts, those cavalries of crucified dreams, those ledgers of broken attempts." Come then, the good incendiaries with their charred fingers. Here they come, set fire to the shelves of the libraries, deviate the course of canals to flood the cellars of the museums. Oh, may the glorious canvases drift helplessly, seize pickaxes and hammers, sap the foundation of the venerable cities. The oldest among us is 30. We have therefore 10 years at least to accomplish our task. When we are 40, let others, younger and more valiant, throw us into the basket like useless manuscripts. They will come against us from afar, from everywhere, bounding upon the lightsome measure of their first poems, scratching the air with their hooked fingers, and scenting at the academy doors the pleasant odor of our rotting minds, marked out already for the catacombs of the libraries. That is a vivid piece of humor. It is as amusing as Marinetti's portrait of himself at the Doré Gallery. A portrait the head of which is a clothes brush and the hat of a tobacco tin, a toy which would be in its right place not at an exhibition of paintings and sculpture, but in the nursery squares of Mrs. Bland's Magic City. As a matter of fact, however, Futurism as an artistic method seems to have only the slightest connection with Marinetti's neo-Zarathustrianisms. The Futurist painters give us not the blood that Marinetti calls for, but diagrams, as free from implications of bloodshed as a weather chart, or the illustrations in an engineering journal. These artists are not primarily concerned with protesting against the conversion of Italy into a market for second-hand dealers. They aim at inventing a new kind of art, which shall be able to paint not objects in terms of form and color, but the movements of objects and the states of mind of those who see them. They have invented a jargon about simultaneousness, dynamism, ambiance, and so forth, which is about as impressive as the writings of Mrs. Eddy. And they paint in the same jargon in which they write. Paint the soul, never mind the legs and the arms, recommended the cleric in Fra Lippo Lippi. Paint the simultaneousness, never mind the legs and the arms, is the golden rule of the futurist. They have conceived a strange contempt for the visible world. They tell us that a running horse has not 4 legs but 20, but that is no reason for leaving the horse entirely out of the picture, as some of the enthusiasts do. They do not realize that our sensations about horse and the movements of horse can only be painted in terms of horse. That art is not a dissipation of life into wavy lines and dots and dashes, but the opposite. There may be a science of futurism in which the force lines of a horse or a motor car may be part of a useful diagram. These arbitrary lines, however, have no more to do with imaginative art than the plus and minus signs in arithmetic. Occasionally, of course, there is an obvious symbolism in the lines, as in the charging angles, which represent the dynamism of a motor car, but this is merely speed expressed by a commonplace symbol, instead of by a symbolic impression of the flying car itself. This is an intellectual game rather than an art. Occasionally it gives us a wonderful piece of broken impressionism, but the stricter futurists are symbolistic beyond all understanding. Their work is like an allegory, to the meaning of which no one has a key, an allegory printed in the hieroglyphs of an unknown language. End of section 26.
Chapter 27. A Defense of Critics. Mr. E. F. Benson has been attacking the critics, and reviving against them the old accusations that they are merely men who have failed in the arts. There could scarcely be a more unsupported theory. As a matter of fact, to take Mr. Benson's own art, there are probably far more bad critics who end up as novelists than there are bad novelists who end up as critics. Criticism is usually the beginning, and not the decadence of a man's authorship. Young men nowadays criticize before they graduate. One becomes a critic when one puts on long trousers. It is as natural as writing poetry. Indeed, the gift seems in some ways to be related to poetry. It springs at its best from the same well of imagination. This is not to compare the art of the critic to the art of the poet in importance, but only in kind. Criticism is by its nature bound to keep closer to the earth than poetry. It has frequently more resemblance to the hedge sparrow than to the lark. It is a chatterbox of argument, not a divine spendthrift of the beauty that is above argument. It is the interpreter of an interpretation. It gives us beauty second hand. Critics are compared somewhere to brushers of noblemen's clothes. In an honest world, however, one might brush a nobleman's clothes not out of servility, but out of tidiness. There would have been nothing degrading in it if Queen Elizabeth herself had ironed the stains out of Shakespeare's doublet, provided she had done it from decent motives. Critics of the better sort need not worry when their service is misconstrued as servitude. Those who attack them are usually men who are under the delusion that it is better to be a bad artist than a good critic. Thus we find the author of Lanky Bill and his Dog Bluebeard looking down with patronage on a man like Hazlitt because he lacks something that is called the creative gift. Even the life and work of Walter Pater have not succeeded in dispelling the popular notion that the imagination is more honorably employed in inventing sentences for sawdust figures than in relating the experience of one's own soul. According to this standard, Mr. Charles Garbus must be ranked higher among imaginative authors than Sir Thomas Browne, and the essays of Elia must give place to the novels of Mrs. Florence Barclay. Clearly, no line can be drawn on principles of that kind between imaginative and unimaginative literature. The artists, for the most part, are as lacking in imagination as the critics. They have merely chosen a more luxurious form of writing. Oscar Wilde used to say that anybody could make history, but only a man of genius could write it. And one might contend in the same way that nearly anybody can make literature, but only a clever man can criticize it. The genius of the critic is as much an original gift as the genius of a runner or a composer. One need not go back further than Dryden to realize to what extent the successful artists have thrown themselves into the work of criticism. Most of us nowadays find Dryden's prefaces and his essay on dramatic poesy easier reading than his verse, and in the age that followed, criticism seems to have come as naturally to the men of letters as conversation. Addison, commonplace critic though he was always airing his views on poetry and music, and what is Pope's Dunciad but a comic epic of criticism? Nor was Dr. Johnson less concerned with thumping the cushion in the matter of literature than in the matter of morals. His Lives of the Poets does not seem a great book to us who have been brought up on the romantic criticism of the 19th century, but it is an infinitely better book than Rosales, which has the single advantage that it is shorter. And so one might go on through the list of great men in letters from Johnson's to our own day. Burke, Scott, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Macaulay, Carlyle, Thackeray, Ruskin, Matthew Arnold, Swinburne, Pater, Meredith, Stevenson. I choose more or less at a hazard a list of imaginative writers who are in the very midstream of English criticism. Even in our own day, how many of the poets and novelists have graduated as critics? What lover of Mr. Henry James is there who would not almost be willing to sacrifice one of his novels rather than his partial portraits? Who is there, even among the Mr. Bernard Shaw's detractors, who would wish his dramatic criticisms unwritten? And who would not exchange a great deal of Mr. George Moore's fiction for another book like Impressions and Opinions? Similarly, Mr. W. B. Yeats has revealed his genius in a book of criticism like Ideas of Good and Evil, no less than in a book of verse like The Wind Among the Reeds. Mr. William Watson's works include a volume of Excursions in Criticism. Sir Arthur Quiller Couch has published 2 volumes of critical causeries. Mr. Max Beerbohm is no less distinguished as a critic than as a caricaturist. A.E. reviews books in the Irish Times, and Mr. Walter de la Mare in the Westminster Gazette. Here surely is a list that may suggest a doubt in the minds of those who take the view that the critics are merely a mob of embittered hacks who have failed at everything else. This is one of those traditional fallacies, like the stage Irishman, which men accept apparently for the sake of ease. Even the most superficial inquiries at the offices of the newspapers and the weekly reviews would reveal the fact that a great percentage of the best poets and novelists either are engaged or have been engaged in their green and generous days in the work of criticism. If Shakespeare were alive today, he would probably earn his living at first, not by holding horses' heads, but by turning dramatic critic. Every artist worth his salt has in him the makings of a journalist. Milton himself was as ferocious a pamphleteer as any of those blood and thunder rectors whom we see quoted by Sub Rosa in the Daily News. Tolstoy was as furiously active, if not so furiously bitter, a journalist. And who is the most charming and graceful journalist and critic of our own day but the charming and graceful novelist Anatole France? All this, however, is no reply to Mr. Benson's indictment of the critics on the ground that they do not discover genius, but that the public has to discover genius in spite of them. It is one of those indictments which can only be believed on the assumption that the critics are a race apart who think, as it were, en masse. Those who repeat it seem to regard the critics as a disciplined army of destruction instead of realizing that they are a hopelessly straggling company of more or less ordinary men and women of varying tastes, with a sprinkling of men and women of genius among them. They tell us that the critics attack the Pre-Raphaelites, but they forget that Ruskin was a critic and a prophet of the Pre-Raphaelites. They tell us that the critics cold-shouldered Browning, but W.J. Fox wrote enthusiastically of Browning almost from the first, and Pater praised him in his early essays, It was a poet who, alas, was not a critic, Tennyson, who said the severest things about him. Ibsen, again, is constantly cited as an example of an artist who had to make his way to public acceptance through mobs of shrieking critics. But what do we find to be the case? In England, three of the most remarkable critics of their time, Mr. Bernard Shaw, Mr. Edmund Gosse, and Mr. William Archer, fought a desperate fight for Ibsen against almost the entire British public. The critics who attacked Ibsen did not represent the flower of British criticism, but the flower of the British public. It will be found, I believe, to be an almost invariable rule that whenever the critics have attacked men of genius, they have had the public at their back cheering them on. There are critics, indeed, who make themselves into the hired mouthpieces of the public. They long to express not what they themselves think, for they do not think, but what the public thinks, although it does not think. Can Mr. Benson point to any notable catch of genius ever made by critics of this kind? I do not, of course, contend that even the most intelligent reviewer in these days, who is one of the most hard-worked of journalists, is in a good position for discovering new stars of genius. No man can appreciate a Shakespeare that is thrown at his head, and books are thrown at the heads of reviewers nowadays in numbers likely to stun or bewilder rather than to evoke the mood of rapturous understanding. As for the reviewers, they are as varied a crowd as the rest of the public. One of them enjoys The Scarlet Pimpernel better than Shakespeare. Another blames Miss Marie Corelli for not writing like Donne. Another has read and rather liked Shelley. On the whole, they are fonder of good books than most people. They have to read so many bad books as a duty that many of them ultimately get a taste for literature as a blessed relief. But as for attacking men of genius, why, 9 out of 10 of them would not attack a mouse unless the prejudices of the public they reverence drove them to it. They are very nice and affable, like the gentleman in You Never Can Tell, the nicest and most affable set of human beings that ever manufactured butter outside a dairy. End of Chapter 27. Chapter 28. On the Beauty of Statistics. One of the most unexpected pages in Sir Edward Cook's Life of Florence Nightingale is that in which he describes Miss Nightingale, in a phrase Lord Goschen once used about himself, as a passionate statistician. Somehow one did not associate statistics with Florence Nightingale. She had already taken her place in the sentimental history of the world as the angel of the wounded soldier. It is a disturbance to one's preconceptions to be asked to regard her as the angel among the blue books. As Sir Edward Cook reveals her to us, however, she is ardent in the pursuit of figures as other women in pursuit of a figure. We read how she helped one of the general secretaries of the International Statistical Congress of 1860 to draw up the program for the section dealing with the sanitary statistics, at which, indeed, her own pet scheme for uniform hospital statistics was the chief subject of discussion. Her faith in statistics, however, went far beyond that of statistical congresses. She believed that statistics were, in a measure, the voice of God. The laws of God were the laws of life, and these were ascertainable by careful and especially by statistical inquiry. That is how Sir Edward Cook explains his remark that her passion for statistics was even a religious passion. It is by no means to be wondered at that the religion of statistics made its appearance in the 19th century. The surprising thing is that no church has yet been founded in its honor. In the history of religion, philosophy, and magic, numbers have again and again played a leading part, and what are statistics but numbers on regimental parade? Pythagoras found in number the ultimate principle of creation. Xenocrates went a step further when he defined the soul as a number which moves itself. To the unphilosophical reader, the definition of Xenocrates is the merest riddle till one realizes that he was probably trying to destroy the idea that the soul was something material, a fact of space, as might be connoted by words like thing or living being. This is why, in order to express the soul, it was necessary to use an abstraction, and what so abstract as number? Nor did the numerical explanation of the universe stop here. Pure reason, Gompers tells us, in speaking of the Pythagoreans and Greek thinkers, was assimilated to unity, knowledge to duality, opinion to triplicity, sense perception to quadruplicity. What a jargon it all seems, a game of the intellect. But the heavenly arithmetic has lingered in the world to our own day, and among simple people too. The mystery of numbers has entered into folklore as well as into philosophy, as that fine jingle, "Green grow the rushes, oh," which survives in half a dozen English counties, shows. It has always seemed to me the perfect expression of the fantastic lyricism of numbers. "I'll sing you 1-0. Green grow the rushes, oh. What is your 1-0?" And so on till we reach the number 12 in the catalogue of holy delights. 12 are the 12 apostles, 11 went up to heaven, 10 are the 10 commandments, 9 are the bright shiners, 8 are the bold reigners, 7 are the stars in heaven, 6 are the proud walkers, 5 are the symbols at your door, 4 are the gospel makers, 3 is the rivals, 2 is the lily white boys clothed all in green, oh. 1 is one and all alone, and evermore shall be so. What it all means is for the folklorists to dispute about. It is interesting in the present connection chiefly as the ruins of an arithmetical statement of the mysteries of the universe. Similar chants of numbers are known in all religions. They are common to Christianity, Mohammedanism, and Judaism. One is told that, on the night of the Passover, Jewish families chant a list of numbers beginning "Who knoweth 1?" and going on to "Who knoweth 13?" with its answer, "I, saith Israel, know 13 divine attributes, 12 tribes, 11 stars, 10 commandments, 9 months preceding childbirth, 8 days preceding circumcision, 7 days of the week, 6 books of the Mishnah, 5 books of the law, 4 matrons, 3 patriarchs, 2 tables of the covenant, but one is our God, who is over the heavens and the earth." This list may be regarded as a mere aid to memory, and no doubt it is to some extent that. But it is also an example of the religious use of numbers, a use which has given various numbers of magic significance. One has an example of this magic significance in the custom among those who resort to holy wells of walking around the well 9 times in the opposite direction to the sun. One always has to do things by 3s or 7s or 9s. Similarly, the belief in the maleficent power of 13 is commoner in London than in Patagonia, where, indeed, they did not know how to count up to 13. One remembers, too, how in recent years the prophetic sort of evangelical Christians were on the lookout for some great statesman or conqueror upon whom they could fix the dreaded number of the Antichrist, 666. First it was Napoleon, later it was Gladstone, the letters of whose name, if you slightly misspelt it in Greek, stood for numbers which added up to the awful total. I recall the relief with which in my own childhood I discovered the fact that, however wrongly my name was spelt, and in whatever language, it was not possible to work out 666 as the answer. So much for the mysteries of numbers. To most people, the whole thing will appear a chronicle of superstitions, as astrology does. But just as astronomy has taken the place of the superstitions of the stars, so statistics has taken the place of the superstitions of numbers. It is as though men had suspected all along that stars and numbers had some significance beyond their immediate use and beauty, but for hundreds of years they could only guess what it was. It was not till the 18th century, indeed, that the science of statistics was discovered, under its present name at least, and ever since then men have been debating whether it is a science or only a method. Whichever you prefer to call it, it may be described as an explanation of human society in terms of number. It is the discovery of the most efficient symbols that have yet been invented for the realistic portraiture of men in the mass. Symbols, I say advisedly, for statistics is more closely allied to Oriental than to Western art, in that it avoids the direct imitation of life and appeals to the imagination through conventional figures. Perhaps it is a certain suspicion of Orientalism that accounts for the fanatical hatred of statistics which still exists among many of the apostles of the West, for statistics is a new thing which has had to fight as desperately for recognition as Impressionist art or Wagnerian opera. Infuriated Victorians still speak of lies, damn lies, and statistics as the 3 degrees of wickedness, and the statistician is denounced in superlatives as a sort of jailer of humanity, who would give us all numbers instead of names. Now, I'm not concerned to defend bad statisticians any more than bad artists. Statistics has its charlatans, its bounders after a new thing, as well as its Da Vinci's and its Michelangelos. Or perhaps it is more comparable to music than to painting or sculpture. The philosophy of number is the philosophy of proportion, of harmony, of rhythm, and statistics is the study of the proportions, harmonies, rhythms of society. Music and poetry, it should be remembered, are both an affair of number. I lisped in numbers, said the poet, for the numbers came. And the statistician has the same apology. Statistics, of course, is largely concerned, like the arts, with the disharmonies of life, but it deals with them in terms of harmony. It is a method of asserting order amid chaos, and that is why the lovers of chaos attempt to spread the idea among the people that statistics is a dangerous innovation, a black-coated tyranny. That is why landlords who benefit by the social chaos have fought so hard against the valuation of land, and churches against the registration of ecclesiastical property. Similarly, there was a middle-class party that denounced the income tax because it would mean a statistical inquest into the wealth of manufacturers and shopkeepers. Among savage tribes, we are told, it is a common custom to hide one's name, because those who know one's name have a magic power over one's soul. Similarly, in civilized societies, the rich man likes to hide his number. He knows that in some way the knowledge of this will give society a new control over him. It is possible to ignore all the evils of monopolized riches till one knows the numbers of the rich. To many people it is a turning point in social and political belief to discover such a fact as that of the total income of Great Britain and Ireland in 1908, 5,500,000 people received £909 million, while 39 million people received £935 million. In other words, the fact that 1/2 of the wealth of Great Britain and Ireland goes to the 12% of the population who belong to the class with incomes over £160 a year. It is a terrible revelation both of poverty and of riches. The figures thunder at one's imagination more effectively than a sea of rhetoric. And the figures concerning destitution and the housing of the poor are still more terrible in their realism. Shelley never wrote a revolutionary hymn that more surely prophesied the coming of a new society. Social greed, that has withstood 10,000 prophets and poets, at last begins to feel troubled in the unaccustomed presence of the statistician. Not the statistician in his study, of course. He is no more than a dry-as-dust inventor. But the statistician, like Florence Nightingale, with the genius of a fine purpose and a sure aim with sure facts. This is not to discredit any of the old battalions of reform. It is merely to hail the coming of the new regiment of the statisticians, who fight with tables instead of swords, and whose leaders exhort them on the eve of battle with passages out of blue books. Statistics and the man I sing. Let the next great epic be an arithmiad. End of chapter 28. End of the book of This and That by Robert Lynd.